shut up on that side then. Right, let's resume with the next topic. Just before we do, we've had a look at the programming. So this afternoon we've obviously got the socio-economic witness for the council in chief, and then I would imagine part cross-examination, looking at the time estimates. Not an ideal arrangement, but it's how it's going to have to be. And then tomorrow we'll continue with the cross-examination and then move on to Mr. Chapman for PCAA. And I reckon that we can probably conclude Dr. Chapman, isn't it? My apologies. Dr. Chapman tomorrow, which then means that on Tuesday of next week, it will be Mr. Brass for the second time. And I think that'll take up, give or take, pretty well the whole of Tuesday next week, which Mr. Brass, you said you would be attending virtually, and at the moment it's looking very likely as though one of us will be attending virtually as well. So that'll be an interesting experience. So basically we're pushing one day from this week into next week. Programme Officer will put out a new timetable for next week, but we think we'll probably get through most of it next week, if not all of it. So we're not too worried about that. So with that.
Okay, right, let's move on to socioeconomics. Mr. Taylor, are you ready to call your first witness?
Sir, I am, thank you. I'm going to introduce Mr. Ciro to the inquiry, just as I did Mr. Foley, if that's okay, with a short introduction from his proof. His summary is actually rather short, it's about 3 or 4 pages, so we're going to read from that. And then I'm going to take him through a number of discrete points that are the points, as I understand it, that are in issue between the parties. You'll need Mr. Ciro's proof and his summary, obviously. You'll need Mr. Brass's socio-economic proof and rebuttal. I think I've got a number of other CD documents. I'm afraid we didn't get a chance to produce a list because we were busy producing another document overnight. Do you want me to give you the CD numbers now, or as we go? Okay, so it's CD 2.8 is the first one, which is the original economic impact assessment. CD 222, which is the updated socio-economic impact assessment. Then we've got CD 1110. Of course, I haven't written down what that one is. It is to do with levelling up agenda. We've got CD 1314, which is the city study from 2011 that we're becoming steadily familiar with. CD 9.136, which is the Jet Zero evidence and analysis document. And last but not least, CD 11.59, that I think is a study about the relationship between Cardiff and Bristol airports that's been connected, which is relevant to the consideration of displacement. Right.
Is that the order in which I'm going to need them as well?
That should be. Yeah. We might jump around a little bit, but that's the order in which they. I think they're going to appear, but if it changes, don't shoot me. Okay, Mr. Ciro, you are John Ciro, is that correct?
I am, yes.
And you're the Director of Economics and Global Technical Lead for Transport Economics at Jacobs.
That's correct.
And you explain you have over 30 years' experience working both in government and the private sector, covering economic policy, regeneration, local economic development, inward investment, tourism and transport.
I do, yes.
Thank you. You explain that you've got a Bachelor of Science degree with honours in economics from the University College at Swansea, and a Master of Science degree in economics from Birkbeck University of London and a diploma in transport also from Birkbeck. And
Really?
you're currently the chair of the Transport Economics, Finance and Appraisal Committee of the European Transport Conference.
I
Is
am.
that right? Thank you. You explain in your evidence that you've acted as an expert witness for transport and economic development matters at planning inquiries, examinations in public and scrutiny committees in the past, is that right?
I have, yes.
And in the last 5 years, you explain that that's included the A465 dualling scheme, where you were the expert witness addressing direct and wider economic impacts, and you also acted as the economics expert witness in the Silvertown Tunnel project, which was approved by the Secretary of State for Transport. You advised HS2 Limited on socio-economic, community health and equality impact assessments for all phases of that scheme over the last 10 years or so, is that
That's
right?
correct.
And indeed, you acted as advisor to the HS2's expert witness in relation to economics during the Select Committee hearings.
That's correct.
Thank you. You also explained that more locally to where we sit, you were the economic expert witness at a public inquiry into the proposed expansion of Sanders Garden World in Sedgemoor.
That's correct.
Thank you. In relation to airports, you explained that you've advised on the economic impacts of the proposed estuary airport for transport for London, the wider economic impacts of a proposed third runway for Heathrow for the GLA and the British Chamber of Commerce, and the local and regional economic impacts of expanding Stansted Airport.
That's correct.
Thank you. You've also advised in terms of into the economic impacts of smaller regional airports, including St Helena in the South Atlantic, Galway and Waterford airports in Ireland too, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you explain you've advised the CAA, the Civil Aviation Authority, in relation to regulatory aspects of surface access to airports and the use of economic analysis to assess proposed changes to the use of airspace.
That's correct.
Thank you. Excuse me. All right. The rest of your experience is set out in paragraphs 1.15 to 17 in your evidence. Now, with that short introduction, can I ask you, please, to take out your summary proof, and we can skip the summary of the introduction that we've just done, and perhaps you could be so kind as to read your proof from section 1.2.
Thank you. So the section 1.2 is the economic context and policy. So the North Somerset Council area and the west of England generally are prosperous areas with average GDP per capita 20% higher than the UK, excluding London, average, as well as higher rates of economic activity and lower levels of unemployment than the national average. Employment growth between 2012 and 2019 was over 15% in both areas, again higher than the national average, while levels of deprivation are significantly lower than the national average. Tourism, which is overwhelmingly domestic, is important to North Somerset, and the restrictions placed on overseas travel is seen as a considerable opportunity for the area to attract and retain new visitors to the area. The pandemic has encouraged North Somerset Council to change its economic focus to investing in supporting local businesses, which in turn support the local economy, improving digital access, and developing a low-carbon economy and green recovery. While Bristol Airport is a major employer in the area, the net economic benefits of its expansion are overstated, and it will not provide the significant economic benefits claimed. This is due to an overestimation of the business productivity benefits of expansion, an underestimation of the level of displacement, and a failure to take a balanced approach to future uncertainty. It should be noted that my alternative assessments are often presented as a range of possible outcomes. This reflects the level of uncertainty inherent with assessments of its nature and their sensitivity to the underlying assumptions used. Business productivity. The appellant's assumption is that by 2030, business passenger numbers will make up the same proportion, 13.8%, of total passenger throughput as in 2019. The pandemic and the climate emergency have changed attitudes to business travel, which had already been stagnant for many years. there is no guarantee that additional business destinations will be available in 2030, or that businesses will not be able to successfully undertake their activities online in future. Hence, a conservative economic assessment would assume that the marginal productivity benefits from expansion are effectively zero. An optimistic approach might be to assume that the differential growth rates between business and leisure passengers, which over the last 20 years were 4.2% versus 8.1%, would grow to the extent that it doubles. That is, leisure traffic grows 4 times faster than business travel. This would mean business passenger numbers increase by effectively half the level suggested by the appellant. Hence, in my opinion, business productivity benefits will range from 0 to half the level proposed by the appellant. Direct employment impacts. You will have seen that both ourselves and the appellant have submitted a errata to you. In our view, the amount of time needed to sort of resolve the differences between us is probably not worth the time of the inquiry, and we're content to take the appellant's views on the direct employment impacts. Displacement. Displacement is the proportion of passengers who would have travelled from other airports in the region if expansion did not occur at Bristol. The appellant's updated assessment estimates 28% of passengers would have flown from other airports in this region in a without expansion scenario. The remaining 72% are estimated to use airports further afield, such as Gatwick and Heathrow, or choose not to fly. There is clear evidence of considerable overlap in catchment areas of airports serving the South West and South Wales. Using the appellant's own transport data, this suggests that 12% of passengers that reside in North Somerset, 13% in West of England, and 52% in the South West and South Wales region would travel to other airports in the South West and South Wales. Hence, not only are the majority of passengers displaced from other airports in the South West and Wales, these competing airports are all in less prosperous locations. There is then the question of passengers who would not have flown if the airport did not expand. One can realistically assume that domestic passengers will spend an equivalent amount of money on other activities as they would have spent on flying from Bristol. There is no reason to suggest why a similar proportion would not have been spent locally in the region, thereby supporting local GVA and jobs. This would mean that the only additional spend arising in the South West and South Wales comes from those who decide to fly from airports outside the region and foreign travellers. Hence, the real level of displacement is considerably higher than proposed by the appellant, and the level of benefits in terms of GVA and jobs is effectively halved. As stated in the appellant's 2018 economic assessment document, the majority of direct jobs are likely to require either basic skills or supervisory skills at the equivalent levels of NVQ levels 1 and 2, and with a range of managerial jobs at a higher level. This contrasts with North Somerset's economic policies that are aiming to improve the skill sets of its resident population. Uncertainty. There is considerable economic uncertainty following Brexit. This uncertainty relates to the growth of the economy, which tends to drive demand for travel, and the changing nature of the UK's workforce. With the ending of the free movement of labour, the number of people from Eastern and Central Europe travelling to and from the UK is likely to fall. Prior to Brexit, nearly 10% of passengers from Bristol Airport were travelling to destinations in this region, with routes often underpinned by EU nationals travelling to and from their home countries. The negative economic impacts of outbound tourism is currently not included within the appellant's economic assessment. This is contrary to guidance in HM Treasury Green Book, sorry, it's an additional word that shouldn't be there, which requires all significant costs and benefits that affect the welfare and well-being of the population to be taken into consideration. This is not an argument to suggest government should be constraining people from flying, in the same way that assessing the full costs and benefits of surface transport policy and interventions is not seen as constraining people's ability to drive. Rather, it is ensuring that decision makers are aware of all the costs and benefits before coming to a decision. My analysis suggests an annual negative impact of £123 million in 2030, which is currently not included within the appellant's economic assessment. Carbon costs and other environmental impacts. While carbon costs have been included as part of the appellant's sensitivity test, noise and air quality impacts have not been assessed in the economic case and have not been included in the economic analysis. All three of these environmental impacts should be included in the core economic assessment. In conclusion, I believe the economic benefits of the proposed expansion have been significantly overstated across a number of different areas, and a comprehensive estimation of the negative impacts has not been undertaken. In addition, the economic impacts are highly sensitive to the underlying assumptions used, which are subject to considerable uncertainty at the present time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sira. Now, the first thing I want to ask you about, if I may, relates under the sort of heading changes of circumstances. And what I want to ask you is whether you could identify circumstances which have changed since officers expressed their views to committee in March of last year.
So there have been considerable changes since that original advice by officers. I find it's off-putting where the microphone's up. The first and most obvious one is the pandemic, which has led to the biggest change in working practices for office-based workers that we've probably ever seen, and that includes changes to business travel. The second element is the whole net zero situation, which now includes international aviation, and we've already heard within the inquiry of COP26 and the government seeking to sign up businesses to net zero. We've got the UK's new target in law to slash emissions by 78% by 2035, and the UK's sixth carbon budget, which is incorporating the UK's share of international aviation for the first time. We've seen new demand forecasts submitted from BAL in November 2020. And we've seen the new economic assessment, so that's CD 222 from BAL, which reduces the economic impacts very significantly from those which were originally assessed on behalf of BAL and presented to members. So if you were to look at CD 208, page 59, figure 6.1.
Right, let's get there.
Sorry, CD 208. Is it 2.08 or
Yeah, 2.08.
2.0?
Yeah, sorry.
Page number?
So it's page 59, figure 6.1.
So that's the PDF page 67.
Have you got that, sir?
Not yet. 1 second.
So I'm not sure if other people are experiencing a difficulty. 2.08 brings up, it's described as economic impact assessment, but it brings up a document entitled Intelligent Data Collection Limited, Bristol Airport. I don't know whether...
That might explain people's...
It's okay, I've got it now.
So do you have the
Yes.
have that document?
Yeah, direct document.
All right. Well, we'll need to make a note of that difficulty, Mr. Morehouse. Thank you for pointing that out, and we'll make sure that gets changed on the inquiry library.
So hopefully when people have found it. So on page 59, figure 6.1, you'll see if the net present value there in that sort of waterfall chart of 1,565,000,000. If you turn to CD 2.22, on page 36,
That's internal page, there's PDF page 39. So.
Thank you.
on that page, and I think on the next page, you'll see two figures, 4.12 and 4.13, and that shows the net present value has been reduced to 820 or 863 million, depending on which figure you look at and what they include. In the same document, CD 2.22, on table 3.13, page 31, the appellant shows the difference between the original submission, which was in 2.08, and they produced a one table to provide an easy comparison, and that shows at the South West and South Wales level a GVA reduction from the original case of £80 million, 1,150 fewer jobs, and 915 fewer full-time equivalents. So reductions of over 20%. So the economic benefits of the proposed development on Bowell's own case has been dramatically reduced. We also, I think, saw 2 days ago now, as part of the errata that was put in, that those displacement effects, which was one of the reasons why those numbers have reduced, is no longer regarded as a sensitivity, but is now part of the core forecasts. And I think that's the first time that that's been acknowledged as being part of the core forecasts since we started raising this issue back from 2019. Then the final thing that has changed since the original advice by officers is the government's levelling up agenda, which has come to the fore considerably.
Okay. Thank you. Now, let's move on from that broad topic on to look at, I've got the heading economic context. Now, we heard from Mr. Brass already a little bit about the economic context of the locality for Bristol Airport. Can you, how can you summarise, please, the economic context that we need to see this application within?
So as Mr. Brass rightly pointed out, the west of England is already a very prosperous location. It's got high levels of GDP. And if you were to look at my proof on page 10, you will see that the comments I referred to in my summary at the beginning, the opening statement, effectively the changes in employment and the unemployment rate, showing that North Somerset and the west of England have generally outperformed the UK as a whole. I think the key point here, though, is if you turn to table 3.2 on page 18, and again, as Mr. Brass alluded to, the west of England is far more prosperous than other areas in the southwest, and more crucially, is a far more prosperous area than those locations which have airports within the southwest and South Wales. So you can see on table 3.2 some considerable differences in GVA per head between the Bristol area and all the other areas. So the west of England, as we've said, is very much a prosperous location, far more prosperous than other locations in the southwest and South Wales, which also have airports within their local areas.
Thank you. Next topic, the levelling up agenda, which you referred to in your summary of things that have changed. Can you just explain what the levelling up agenda is and how it is, how government is seeking to operate it in practice?
So we've heard references to the Treasury document CD 1110, Building Back Better. The government has a view that parts of the country have fallen behind other parts of the country. And in Building Back Better, CD 1110, on page 36, there was an announcement of the Levelling Up Fund, consisting of £4.8 billion worth of expenditure. Now, the basis of distribution of that fund is that money is allocated to local authorities most in need of levelling up in England, and identified in an index which was published alongside the Levelling Up Fund prospectus. And that prospectus, or its index alongside it, ranked local authorities from 1 to 3, where 1 is a local authority of highest priority need of levelling up, 2 is obviously in the middle, and 3 is the least required levelling up. 2 of those priority 1 areas are in Greater London, and perhaps rather ironically, one of them is Newham, which is the home of London City Airport. And I'm not sure how it would go down if investment in London City Airport was being talked about as helping levelling up. So, as I said, 2 of the most deprived areas in that are already in London. Of the 4 local authorities that make up the west of England, 3 of those are level 2, and 1, South Gloucestershire, is level 1, i.e. least in need of levelling up. On the other hand, as we've already seen from that table 3.2 in my proof, other areas have a lower GVA per head, and Cardiff, where a significant proportion of demand is derived from, is a level 1 area, and hence the government is saying that is an area of prioritisation. So the levelling up agenda is not a situation of London and the South East versus the rest of the country. It's much more nuanced than that. I think the Prime Minister in his speech recently on levelling up referred to the differences within regions as much as the differences between regions. So, as I said, levelling up is not just London and the South East. Investment there is bad and elsewhere it is good. It is much more nuanced in that, in identifying areas actually in need of investment and support.
All right, thank you. Next heading, already becoming a familiar topic, business passengers. Now, in your proof of evidence, I think you turned to this issue, yes, page 20. And you refer on page 21 to a number of sources, including a Pan-European 2021 YouGov poll. Now, can you just take us through, please, a summary of what you say we need to draw from the YouGov poll of business passengers?
So already in the inquiry we've heard statements about attitudes of passenger or people to flying, but when it comes to business, it's actually the attitude of people's employers which is important, not the necessarily attitudes of the individuals themselves. And in the YouGov poll, it showed the level of respondents' views on how their productivity has changed as a result of them not being able to fly. And that poll found that 28% of respondents said their productivity had worsened as a result of not being able to fly for business. So obviously their businesses would like to see them back in the air as soon as possible. However, 60% said it had no impact, and there's a typo in that section which we provided an errata for. 12% says it makes their productivity better. So 72% of business passengers said their productivity was not impacted or had actually improved by not flying. And businesses, for them, if their productivity is not impacted and travel by air is a substantial cost, both in the actual cost of a ticket, but also the time, they will be seeking to reduce that level of travel. We've already heard earlier from Mr. Foley with his experiences. I too do a substantial amount of work in the Middle East. The expectations were that you jumped on a plane, you flew out to Dubai or wherever it might be to do work. I'm now working in Saudi Arabia. I'm working on 2 projects in Saudi Arabia. It's a country I've never visited. It's a country I'm very unlikely to ever visit. Our colleagues in Dubai have not visited it. It's a contract that's been won during the pandemic with nobody visiting that location in person. The project's been maintained and run without anybody visiting that client in person. So what we're seeing is major changes in how business operates going forward. And sort of moving on to paragraph 4.3.3, there's a comment there from the Financial Times, which is reporting data from the Office for National Statistics, which shows that international business travel has barely grown over the last 19 years compared to a significant increase in leisure travel. So we're seeing a sort of maybe a different story as to what's happening in demand for business travel, coming out of both the evidence, long-term evidence, and also people's expectations going forward as sort of identified from that YouGov poll. And that is just one amongst many. I think Dr. Chapman in his evidence refers to various other press announcements showing other demonstrations of businesses saying they will be reducing their level of travel.
Yes, thank you. Now, I think just sticking with that theme for a moment, Mr. Brass in his rebuttal on socioeconomics at page 16, I think it's page 16, has a graph that might assist us if we just have a look at it. Looking wrong proof. That's not good, is it? Here we are. So, yes, the very top of page 16. Let's just see the heading for that graph's on the previous page. So it's not just us that gets our widows and orphans wrong. I'm pleased to see. Percentage of business passengers at Heathrow Airport is the heading for that figure. What can we draw from that, Mr. Ciro?
So I think, as we've already heard in the inquiry, Heathrow is one of the airports covered by the annual CAA survey every single year. So what we have here is a nice steady progression from 2010 to 2019. And we see that the number of passengers, the proportionate number of passengers travelling for business going through Heathrow Airport has fallen year on year over those 9 years, 10 years. Now we know Heathrow Airport is a constrained airport. We know that the number of passengers travelling through Heathrow Airport still continues to grow though each year. We've heard already in evidence that business passengers are less sensitive to price to leisure passengers. We know that Heathrow Airport is the predominant UK business airport. So even at a situation at Heathrow Airport, we're seeing that continuing steady decline of business passengers as a proportion of all passengers going through that airport.
Thank you. Right, we can put that graph away, and I think we need to go back to your proof, please, back to page 22 that we just left, you set out a number of points from paragraphs 4.3.5 at the bottom of 22 through to your paragraph 4.3.8. I wonder if you could just summarise the key points that you make there.
So I think the points here, and they sort of relate also to the figure 4.1 overleaf on page 24. So again, Mr. Brass, helpfully explained that already from Bristol Airport, you can reach most European destinations, business destinations. There are flights to all those particular locations at the moment. And one of the interesting questions when we talk about the marginal differences of going from an airport handling 10 million to 12 million is, and these are not the figures that BAL are using, but to make them easy for my maths, if we assume that 10 million passengers going through Bristol Airport, 1 million of those are business passengers, and the airport was expanded to 12 million passengers, then the assumption is that still 10% of those passengers will be business passengers. So that's 1.2 million business passengers going through that airport. The question arises because of the types of destinations already available from Bristol Airport, and it's difficult to see why some of those would change. KLM are unlikely to pull out of flying to Amsterdam, and Aer Lingus are unlikely to pull out of flying to Dublin. If the airport was constrained to 10 million passengers, would business passengers actually, if there was still that demand for business travel, and we have doubts about that, but if there was that demand for business travel, would they still actually outbid effectively? They're willing to pay a higher price, leisure passengers, and you could end up with a situation in 2030 of still 1.2 million business passengers and 8.8 million leisure passengers. So that the question is, what is the marginal change in number of business passengers which is actually related to the marginal increase in the capacity of the airport provided? And that's a sort of fundamental question, and considerable uncertainty. And that's in part was the reasons why questions were raised about what additional routes are likely to be flown from Bristol Airport. Because, as we've seen, we can get to most of the major business capitals or business centres within Europe at present. We've heard that Frankfurt is returning back, again, within the existing 10 million cap. So the question arises, what is going to be the marginal increase that would arise in business passengers from an expansion from 10 to 12 million?
Thank you. And you address a number of points as we go through this particular section. You've identified, for example, at 437 that nearly half of Bristol's business passengers are flying on domestic routes, and you analyse the destinations at 438, and you reach the conclusion in that paragraph an increase in capacity of 20% is unlikely to lead to a significant uplift in frequency or new regular services to business destinations based on the present business model. Just help me with this. That statement's based on the present business model. Are you aware of any proposed changes to the present business model?
I'm not, no.
Okay. Next, in this particular area, you also point at 438 to seasonality as an issue. Can you just explain why that matters in terms of business passenger demand?
So as we say in 4.38, in 2019, 133 destinations were served from Bristol Airport, so a huge number of destinations served. But as if you can see, looking at figure 4.1, very few of those destinations are served on either a daily basis or a twice daily basis, so that the regularity for business passengers is not there in many cases. So as we've already heard throughout this inquiry, the airport is principally serving an outward bound tourism leisure market, that the level of services throughout the year required by business travellers is there for a few select centres, and as I said, it's difficult to see why they would change going forward, but most of the destinations are served on an irregular basis, a seasonal basis, or just 1 or 2 flights a week.
Okay, thank you. Now, staying with this subject area about business passengers, if we look at CD 1314, that's the Aviation Services in the City document by York Aviation from 2011. And just want to have a look at this, but in the context of a comment by Mr. Brass in his rebuttal proof at page 11, paragraph 2.2.21. And just to set the context for why we're looking at CD 1314, at 2.2.21, Mr. Brass is commenting on a number of matters about growth. At the bottom of that page, he says, I would comment briefly on Mr. Ciro's contention that businesses will simply be able to undertake their business online in the future. This seems to assume that all business air travel is about meetings, and meetings that can be taken online. This is patently untrue. See that statement? Right, now, let's go to the York Aviation document that we've got at CD 1314. And if we go within that PDF to page 25, we've got a table 3.6 headed Detailed Journey Purpose by Country of Residence, City of London Passengers 2008.
Yes.
Now, just talk us through there the percentage of business passengers who are flying for the purpose of meetings, please.
So as the sentence or the paragraph below that table makes clear, that 81% of trips were for purposes of having meetings, whether that's internal meetings within a company or an organisation, or meeting with customers, suppliers, etc.
Yeah, we can see from the table, we looked at this I think before with Mr. Brass, 557,000 odd journeys attending internal company business.
That's correct.
Okay. And if we go on in the document to page 32, here we've got the 2 bullet points we've looked at before about the company focusing on reducing and where possible eliminating unnecessary air travel for 2 factors, and we've looked at those 2. The paragraph underneath says the key issue in this dynamic is considering the longer term is defining what is and is not necessary travel. Unsurprisingly, it is travel relating to internal company business that has seen the brunt of these reductions. And that's in 2011. We saw that from the table before, 557 meetings were internal company business. It's about 40%, I think, of the total.
39%, I think.
39%, right, okay, I don't want to over-exaggerate. With that in mind, and looking at what is said there about the focus for reductions in travel, and now the context that we have of the use by companies in the last 16 months or so of video technologies and doing business online. What's your view about the trend for trips on internal company business going forward?
So, what we've seen in many organisations, including our own, I think the classic point outlined above was, how do you define a necessary and an unnecessary trip? I think what has changed is the definition of what is an unnecessary trip. What we've found is that as activity has gone online, that we've become so used now to video conferencing, what was a necessary trip has now been identified as an unnecessary trip. And that accounts for both internal meetings and client meetings. I've already outlined our changing experiences of working with clients. The expectation that you turn up in person is no longer there. Obviously, it's very helpful to meet your clients, to build up a relationship with your clients, but those regular meetings you may have held on a monthly basis in person are now happening maybe just once or twice a year. So my manager, for example, has been working out in Singapore for many years. He averages 10 trips a year to Singapore pre-pandemic. Going forward, the expectation now is that you would fly out there once or twice a year. So that for one individual, for a client-related activity, not an internal meeting within the company, is an 80% reduction in business travel. Now that is obviously just one example, and it's dangerous to draw conclusions from one particular individual circumstance. But what we've seen is the adaptation of video technology in a way that none of us experienced. I first used video conferencing over 30 years ago when I was in the Treasury. It still hadn't really taken off many decades later until now. So we've now seen this massive change. And reference was made, we were all used to pre-pandemic having these telephone conference numbers. I think Mr. Humphreys talked about, typing in PIN numbers, etc. But we all know that communication, about 70% of communication is non-verbal communication. Those telephone discussions were never very, can't think of the right word, but they weren't the same as being there in person. Having that video conferencing link where you can actually see the individual, where you can actually share data on screen. I'm going to get in danger here now of advertising particular software, but we use Mural, lots of other softwares available. We have workshops online. 18 months ago, nobody would ever have dreamed of having a workshop with members of the general public, with stakeholders from businesses, from, I've been doing a piece of work recently for a large transport organisation, which will be nameless, where we've used that sort of technology to have discussions with people with disabilities, with employers, and with other stakeholders in government. So the whole way that we do business has changed dramatically, and that is all leading to a reduction in travel. We're not saying that it's not vital that we, as for those of us in the corporate world, we want to see our clients and we want to see them in person, but we no longer need to see them in person every time we have an engagement with them. And that is linked very much to, as has already been highlighted with COP26 and the commitment to zero carbon. So again, it's dangerous to draw conclusions from one example, but I work for a massive multinational company that used to spend a lot of time flying its staff around the world for both internal meetings and external meetings. We have signed up to net zero carbon. The easiest way to get to net zero carbon is reducing things like travel. It's very difficult to retrofit your gas-fired office building. It is far easier to say to people, why do you need to travel? We go through a system where we have to justify our trips. And the two reasons for that, one is for safety, and the second is on climate issues, so to move towards net zero carbon. So the whole business travel situation has changed. What was regarded once as an essential business journey is now no longer regarded as an essential business journey. That meeting can now often be done online.
Thank you. Just sticking with the theme of uncertainty going forward, I think we need to look at CD 9.136. That's the Jet Zero consultation evidence and analysis document. And I wanted to take you to paragraph 3.5 in that document at the end of page 10 that leads on to page 11, which I think they're the same numbers in the PDF. So it's the Jet Zero evidence analysis, CD 9.136, page 10. And paragraph 3.5 explains about the scenarios that are being looked at based on 2017 DFT forecasts of passenger demand, and therefore do not take into account the impact of COVID-19 on aviation demand. To address the short-term fall in emissions, an uncertainty band has been applied to the graphs covering 2020 to 2024. And it says this: however, it's likely that the impacts of COVID-19 on passenger behaviour and demand will continue to be felt long after this. For example, Waypoint 2050 estimates that long-term global air traffic forecasts could be around 16% lower in 2050 than previously predicted. This is a key limitation of our scenarios and should be considered when interpreting the results. Now, how does that view of the potential long-term impact of COVID sit alongside what you were saying?
So I think that the key point here, when it talks about change in passenger behaviour and the impacts of COVID-19 on passenger behaviour, that is not the impacts are in terms of people being scared of travelling. This is the sort of impacts I was talking about before, the changes that have arisen in business practices as a result of the pandemic. What we see in economics is that, long-term relationships, we've talked about how passenger demand is linked to economic growth, etc. Every now and again, something comes along which breaks that connection, and those relationships no longer hold true. And, we have seen, as I said, the biggest change to have occurred in business practices and behaviour for office-based workers who are predominantly the people making those business journeys by air. And what we would expect to see is a change in what has been a long-standing relationship between demand for business travel and those previous, the underlying factors which would have driven that. So it's not unusual, and this is again DFT saying this, it's not unusual for somebody to say, well, hang on, things have changed fundamentally. We would expect them to have done so. And, we obviously still haven't reached a new status quo, so we don't know what those future relationships will be.
All right, thank you. Now, on page 24 of your evidence, please, you explain, given the sorts of points we've just looked at, that you develop two views, what you've called a balanced view and an optimistic view on business passenger productivity benefits. And you set out at 4.3.11 your balanced view, which is that one would assume that the marginal productivity benefits from expansion are effectively zero, and the optimistic approach, where you assume that the differential growth rates would grow to the extent that that relationship between business and leisure passengers doubles, and that would mean business passenger numbers increasing and effectively half the level suggested by the appellant. Now, just so that we understand, can you just explain how that is set out in your table 4.3, which I think enables a comparison between the appellant's estimated and your two balanced and optimistic approaches?
So I think it is worth just sort of touching on the first point. So whenever we do an economic impact assessment, our view is that we should take a conservative approach, a balanced approach to what the economic impact might be of the do something against the do nothing. And in this case, we feel that the evidence is not there to suggest that the growth in business activity has been demonstrated, and therefore we have taken a view that those benefits for business productivity in a conservative approach, there is no evidence that they exist going forward because of the huge uncertainties that exist. In terms of taking our optimistic view, is we have looked at the change in differential between leisure growth and business growth. There is obviously a continued demand for leisure travel. We heard a lot about the forecasting and the overarching numbers. And we would expect leisure travel to bounce back to some degree. We would not expect business demand to grow in line, and therefore we've come up with this range figure. So again, as I said in the sort of introduction, all these, when you look at all these economic documents, they're all full of numbers. And sometimes we lose sight of the fact that beneath those numbers, there are a lot of assumptions. And those assumptions are subject to varying degrees of uncertainty. We are trying to project into the future. And it's one of my personal bugbears that we tend too often in economics to produce a single number of what the future might be. In reality, there is like to be a range of outcomes, and therefore what I've tried to present here is a range of outcomes. We heard in the forecasting, the Monte Carlo assessment, it would have been interesting, sorry, just getting off on a hobby horse here, but I shouldn't do. It would be interesting to see that range of distributions and the probabilities associated with those distributions, because that gives you a much better insight as you can then come to your own judgment as to what you think personally is the more probable outcome. What we get given is an individual's assumption or an organization's assumption of what those outcomes might be. We may have different views. Economists never agree with each other anyway. So, having that range, I think, is important. And I know it's very frustrating for you as inspectors. You would prefer to say, organization A says this, and organization B says Y, and maybe it's halfway between the two. And unfortunately, what I'm saying is even more complicated than that. Actually, what I'm saying is, on our side, there's a range, and the appellant has got a number.
All right, thank you. So, we can see the extent of the range that you've got in table 4.3 for each of the three catchments that you've looked at. So North Somerset, West of England, South West and South Wales, and for each of GVA jobs and full-time equivalents, you've set out your range.
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Now, next, I just want to take us back to Mr. Brass's rebuttal proof, page 10. Here's paragraph 2.2.17. He says, if adopting the same logic as Mr. Ciro, I assume that business and leisure demand retains the same differential as it has in 2012 after recovery from the global financial crisis, then there would in fact be around 3% more business passengers than assumed in the appeal proposal by 2030. You've seen that. So, as I understand it, he's suggesting there that growing from 2012 up to 2019 as after recovery from the global financial crisis. Now, we saw, didn't we, from the table that was put in, I think it's INQ 13, that in fact the numbers of ATMs at Bristol in 2012 were lower than 2008, and in fact the next survey in 2015, the numbers recovered to around about the same, slightly higher, I think, than the 2008 levels. Remember that? So, with that in mind, what do you say is the validity of the exercise that Mr. Brass has done in his 2.2.17?
So I think there are a number of issues here. So one, it very nicely demonstrates that if you change the assumptions, you get a very different number. So it's all back to what those assumptions that you're looking at. We had a long discussion about the various years we should look at and what should be excluded and what shouldn't be excluded. You know, there were one-off events all the way through. We had 9/11, we had the horrendous foot and mouth situation, which closed off a lot of the southwest. We've had a global financial crisis. We've had more than one-offs of airline collapses. We've had Brexit, and hopefully, God willing, we've got a one-off of a pandemic. There have been lots of one-off situations, and I think that there's obviously it has been made clear you've got to start from somewhere doing forecasts, and you know, looking back is helpful to understand relationships. Looking at that sort of 19-year period that Mr. Foley highlighted demonstrates this increase of leisure traffic faster than business traffic. The table we've already seen from Mr. Brass at Heathrow sort of again highlights this long-term decline in business travel. And we've had this fundamental change in how businesses operate post-pandemic. So, you know, trying to sort of identify which year pairing is the best pairing to use to try and to look at what's going to happen in the future is not particularly helpful. And as Mr. Brass rightly says, that's not how the forecasts are done anyway. It's an econometric model. And my point would be is that econometric relationships, the relationships in that econometric model have changed as a result of the pandemic. And, you know, to start getting bogged down into which set of years we look at and comparisons that we look at, I don't think is particularly helpful.
Thank you. Let's turn to the issue of displacement, please. Now, as I think the inquiry is aware, the council hasn't been able to scrutinise the logic model yet, so your evidence is given with that caveat. Can you just explain what displacement is and why it matters?
So displacement occurs when you have some increase in economic activity, but actually in part it's just transferring that economic activity from one location to another. There's no net increase in economic activity. So it can either take away economic activity from a location, or in a growing situation it may take away or reduce the level of growth that might occur in another particular location. Displacement is important in sort of two aspects here. One is to understand what the net impact of the change has been. So we've been looking at various different geographies. Probably best to look at the sort of Southwest and South Wales geography. So what we're trying to understand is what the net benefits of the change has been. And given up the levelling up agenda, what we would want to understand is the impact on other areas which are more in need of levelling up than the west of England is.
Thank you. Now, so to start off looking at this issue, you, I think at page 32 of your proof, look at the issue of catchment areas, your paragraph 6.2.2. I wonder if you could just turn that up. Yeah, at 6.2.2, you refer to the appellant arguing that displacement shouldn't be considered as part of the core analysis, but I think you explained our understanding is that position has changed in recent days.
Yeah, so it's a long history of this. When the original CD 2.08 was put in, displacement was dealt with in a sort of qualitative way, and it was said it was not really an issue of concern. When we were doing the original work for the council, we challenged that. The appellants then produced a displacement figure, and they sort of said that was a sensitivity number, and they are, I think, now have agreed that it is part of the core assessment, and we should be taking displacement into account.
Okay, so then in this paragraph 6.2.2, you refer to overlapping catchment areas of the airports in the southwest and South Wales with Bristol Airport and capacity available, and you refer to the appellant's economic advisors previously advising that Bristol and Cardiff Airport's catchment areas overlap significantly, and you've got that in figure 6.1. Do you remember yesterday, I think it was, Mr. Brass was saying about how Cardiff Airport's catchment was mostly in the sea. Let's just have a look at what York Aviation actually thought in 2014 in figure 6.1. Can you just explain what that's showing, please?
So figure 6.1 shows the sort of 90-minute drive time zones for Bristol and Cardiff airports. This was produced for York Aviation for Bristol Airport, and it shows that the core sort of population centres of around Bristol, around South Wales and the South Wales valleys, there is a considerable overlap between those two airports. And we know, I think it's roughly sort of 21% of passengers who come through Bristol Airport come from South Wales.
Thank you. And just so that we can clarify, because I don't think there's a key, the red outline is the Bristol catchment and the blue is Cardiff, is that right?
I'm looking at a black and white version of it, which is not helpful.
Okay. Well,
I'm sure you're correct.
Not much I can do to help you there. Okay, let's move on. Now, you also look at 6.2.3 at the position of Exeter by reference to an Office of Fair Trading report examining alleged abuse of a dominant position by Flybe, which considered the degree of competition between Bristol and Exeter airports. Can you just summarise what the conclusions of that report were?
So, as you say, it's Office of Fair Trading, looking at a situation for an airline which no longer exists. But one of the key aspects for them was to looking at the level of competition. They used certain thresholds to denote the level of competition, and in this case they were using a 20% threshold. And they were demonstrating for, effectively, these were sort of flights, routes operated by Flybe, that was clear competition between Exeter and Bristol Airport on particular routes. And it just sort of highlights, there is a level of competition between those two airports.
Yeah, so, I mean, in terms of that overlap, not just of catchment, but of routes and destinations served, to what extent are the destinations served by Cardiff, Bournemouth, Exeter and Newquay overlapping with those provided by Bristol Airport?
So if we look at the four airports in around Bournemouth, Cardiff, Exeter and Newquay, we find that 77% of the destinations served by those airports are also served by Bristol. And if you look at individual airports, 96% of destinations served from Bournemouth are served from Bristol. 78% of destinations which are served from Cardiff are also served from Bristol. 77% of destinations from Exeter are also served by Bristol. And 52% of destinations from Newquay are also served by Bristol. So it sort of suggests there is a high level of competition between the various airports in the destinations served, etc.
Okay. Now, the appellant's passenger allocation model looks at the extent of competition between Bristol and the other airports, and indeed identifies effectively what would happen to those other airports if the proposed development in this case were not to happen, and where how passengers would make their travel choices. Yeah. So just summarise what the output of that model is, please, for the 4 airports that we were just discussing.
So if you turn to table 6.2 in my proof, it shows there the percentage number of people in each of the origin regions and the airports they would use if Bristol Airport wasn't to expand. And so, for example, 12% of individuals in North Somerset who would have otherwise travelled out of Bristol Airport, if it doesn't expand beyond 10 million to 12 million, 12% of those passengers would go to Cardiff Airport. And
how many people is that?
So I was just going to go on to this.
Oh, okay, sorry.
If you turn those actually to passenger numbers, which is probably more useful than percentages, what the model shows that 330,000 of those 2 million passengers would otherwise have used Cardiff, 200,000 would have used Exeter, 50,000 would have used Newquay, and 30,000 would have used Bournemouth. That leaves a lot of other passengers, so 570,000 would fly from airports outside the region, and of those 180,000 are assumed to fly from Heathrow. So as already been mentioned, we haven't had the details or the full details of the logic model to understand how these allocations have been done. So these are the numbers based on the appellant's model. So some of the questions that we would have is, why would 180,000 passengers fly from Heathrow, given the very different destinations that are served from Heathrow compared to the destinations served from Bristol? As far as I'm aware, you can't fly to Ibiza and Alicante and the Greek islands from Heathrow Airport. So we still have some questions about that distribution of those 2 million passengers if Bristol Airport was not to be expanded. And the other point, you may recall, we had a conversation about induced demand. And what the appellant is saying is that 760,000 trips would not be made if the airport wasn't to be expanded. So 38% of trips are effectively induced demand at Bristol Airport. So these are the appellant's numbers. As I said, without the airport, a total of 760,000 trips are not expected to be made. So that's induced demand.
Okay. Now, just in terms then of the implication of those numbers, 330,000 people would use Cardiff on the appellant's allocation model if the appellant scheme does not go ahead. How does then granting planning permission for the Bristol Airport scheme in front of this inquiry sit in terms of the levelling up agenda, and given the relative prosperity of the West of England and South Wales?
So if you turn to table 6.3 of my proof, there's a table there which shows by the 4 airports, Cardiff, Newquay, Exeter and Bournemouth, that the bottom section, which is South West and South Wales, gives an indication of the level of benefit would accrue to those areas as a result of those passengers travelling through those airports rather than Bristol. Now, these numbers need to be treated with a considerable degree of caution. They are for the whole of the South West and South Wales. As we saw from the appellant's data, there are direct benefits which accrue directly to the areas around the airport and to where the workers are drawn from. There are indirect benefits that flow from where they spend their money, and there's a sort of supply chain. And we don't have the distribution of employment at all these other airports, so we can't say for exactly how much of that benefit actually accrues to that purely local area around those airports. But, you know, given the numbers we have for that the appellant has put in for Bristol, you know, where virtually half the benefits accrue to the west of England, you would expect a sort of similar half of those benefits at least to accrue to that local area around the airport. So the numbers are only going to be indicative, but they give you an indication of the transfer of benefits that would occur if the expansion did not take place and these other airports to expand. And again, you know, the other caveat I would place on all of this is that these are based on the logic model that the appellant has run, and we haven't done any assessment and analysis of that, and you know, whether we would agree with those figures or not if we were to do that.
Okay, so I mean, just sticking with that, if we look at your table 6.3 in your proof, and we look at Cardiff Airport, for example, your GVA figure is a range between 39 and 57 million pounds, and similarly the jobs range 627 to 795, FTEs 508 to 641. That is an indication, with the caveats you've just given, of a range of impact. It's a range of benefit which would accrue to the South West and South Wales area, in the vicinity of Cardiff Airport, subject to your caveats, if permission is refused.
That is correct, and I should also point out that this is a very conservative assumption, because we've already taken off those business benefits. We either discounted them completely or we've taken 50% of those business benefits. If you were to disagree with that approach and say we should use the appellant's figures for business, then the displacement figures will be even higher for those areas, so the loss of benefit to those areas will be even higher. So, you know, what we have tried to do is, you know, provide a conservative assessment of what those impacts might be.
And so if you grant permission for the appellant scheme, then the sorts of numbers that we're looking at here don't materialise in Cardiff and South Wales. How consistent is that with the levelling up agenda as you described it earlier?
So effectively, you know, it would go against that levelling up agenda. As we've already highlighted, it's not a London and the South East versus the rest of the country. It's looking at disparities both between regions and within regions. Again, you know, the Prime Minister made a comment in his speech about this danger of turbocharging regions which are already turbocharged, which leads to higher levels of congestion, higher house prices and all the rest of it. You know, what we're trying to do, government policy, is literally that levelling up agenda to bring other regions up more towards the average.
All right, thank you. Now, the proportion, the passengers who would fly from airports outside the region, that's 570,000. just so that we understand, I think you addressed that in your evidence at it's page 41 from my note. At 6310. Yeah. And you go on at 6311 to make some comments. Can you just summarise the points that you want the inspectors to bear in mind in relation to this particular aspect of those who would fly from airports outside the region if permission were refused?
So again, the issue here is that we've again, I think, already heard about, you know, a number or significant number of people in the southwest and South Wales fly out of London Airport, Heathrow Airport. And in part, the reason for that is because if you want to travel to North America, Middle East, and virtually anywhere outside Europe, there are no direct flights within the southwest and South Wales region, with the odd one or two exceptions. So you've got this number of passengers from the region who fly out of Heathrow Airport for those reasons. As I've already mentioned, what we sort of struggle to understand is if Bristol was not to expand, and given the nature of destinations served from Bristol, why would we see such a high number of people travelling instead to Heathrow Airport? We would expect them to travel, either remain within the region and those regional airports, or travel to other locations. So again, it comes back to these points about the logic model, and you know, we don't understand the details of it, how it works. We know the theory of how it works, obviously, but you know, not how it's actually been applied in this case, and why we have these high numbers travelling, for example, from Heathrow Airport.
You've explained already about the different price sensitivity of leisure travellers and business travellers. What can you say about the relative expense of travelling from Heathrow in the context of leisure travel?
So the sort of average fares from Heathrow tend to be higher than those from regional airports. So again, you know, you wouldn't expect people to be diverting for leisure trips to Heathrow Airport from the west of England.
Okay, so overall, in terms of your judgment about the proportion of passengers who would be displaced to airports outside of the region, what's your professional judgment as to whether or not the output of the model that's been presented makes sense? What's your view?
To be honest, it's difficult to form a clear judgment. You know, I think we would have questions. It might be that it is correct, but you know, we have some questions about, you know, does it survive a logic test, as it were? And you know, as I say, we haven't seen that details. It may be perfectly fine. It may be, you know, lots of rational explanations of why those numbers come out the way they do. But you know, as I said, some of those numbers look a bit odd to us, but they may be perfectly explainable.
Thank you. Now, you also look in your proof at those who do not fly, and you mentioned those a few moments ago. So let's just have a look and explore the consequences of that in terms of the socio-economic impacts. You address this, I think, particularly on page 35, paragraph 6.36 of your evidence, where you point out that of the 760,000 who don't fly, 14.6 were assumed to be foreign passengers, and so there's a remaining 649,040 passengers, I love that sort of specificity in this situation, that are domestic passengers who don't fly. Now, how does one address the economic implications of that in doing an impact assessment, Mr. Ciro?
So again, it comes back to this point of trying to understand what the economic impact of do something against do nothing. And we have, under a sort of do nothing situation, we have these individuals who don't fly. And To be fair to the appellant, it is incredibly difficult to start putting any numbers on this, what the implications might be, what they might do. But the likelihood is those individuals who are not flying, principally for leisure trips, would be spending their money on doing something else, and the likelihood is they'll be spending money in the local economy. They may not be, but overall, if you take people in the round as to what they're doing, the chances are many of them will be spending money within that local economy, and therefore just to ignore them and pretend they don't exist gives a misleading impression as to what the net benefits are of the situation. And as I say, to be fair to the applicant, it's very difficult to come up with analysis as to what they might do. At one extreme, some people say, they'll stick the money under the mattress, which is highly unlikely. If they're anything like my part of the world, where people haven't been going on holiday, they've been spending money on builders and getting their houses redone. And you talk to local builders, and they never had life so busy. They may buy a UK-built car, they may buy a foreign-built car. There was a whole range of things they could do. But there is data available about the propensity to spend. There is data available on the proportion of spend on imported goods. It is possible to produce a high-level overview with lots of caveats and assumptions, but you can clearly set them out as to what would happen with those individuals, how they would spend the money, and what proportion of that money would be spent within the regional economy. And without doing that, you get this misleading view of what happens with and without a particular investment or decision. So our view is that this should be addressed, and at least some effort made as to putting, again, a range of numbers it's going to be, of quantifying that impact.
Okay, and if we look at table 6.4 in your proof, which I think is on page 39, what do we see there?
So here, what we're showing is, actually the benefits from the scheme are significantly reduced because of this level of, first of all, displacement, and also the fact that people are not travelling. So we end up with some very small numbers as to what the impacts of the scheme actually are, so that the net additional impacts from expansion reduce significantly within the study area, down to a GVA of 135 to 195, and the jobs numbers as well. So, you can see that the actual net benefits are significantly reduced if you go down that route.
So this table, it's headed amount of displacement by geographical region, if account is taken of those who do not fly. So this is the exercise that you were describing earlier that you can do.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Now, I also want to understand what the implications are of the potential sort of compound effects of displacement, and I've got this in mind particularly in relation to Cardiff Airport. Now, I think if we turn to CD 1159 for this, this is a York Aviation document, and it's headed "The Impact of Devolving Air Passenger Duty to Wales." I think it's prepared by York Aviation on behalf of Bristol Airport Limited, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And this document, I think, was undertaken to provide an assessment of the impact on Bristol Airport and the southwest economy of devolving air passenger duty to Wales.
That's correct.
So it's looking at what might happen if that were to occur. And in this document, if we turn to paragraph 110, which is on page 11 of the PDF, I think that's, yeah, we see it, it explains, in addition to the effect brought about by the change in fare, we've also considered the second round effects resulting from the relative change in size between the two airports. As discussed above, Bristol is substantially larger than Cardiff and hence offers a much greater range of services and is generally attractive. However, as both demand shifts between Bristol and Cardiff, with a reduction in prices at Cardiff and as Cardiff benefits from a general stimulatory effect brought about by a lowering of the average cost of flying within the market, that's because of the change to the charges presumably, we would expect the balance in this relationship to change. Cardiff will experience a boost in growth while Bristol will experience a reduction, with the result that Cardiff will become relatively more attractive over time as it takes market share and expands its services. As it does so, for the purposes of this analysis, we have assumed that this will mirror the extent to which both perform above or below what might be expected without any change in the APD situation. And then it explains for Bristol the base case forecast has been provided, whilst for Cardiff we'll have to grow it at the same rate as Bristol. Now, what is the point that's being made there about what happens when one airport grows substantially and the other doesn't?
So ignore anything to do with air passenger duty, because this is not an argument about air passenger duty. But what it is saying is that if a demand starts shifting from one airport to another for whatever reason, then because that airport is expanding, it's got additional passengers, it can start providing additional routes, and it goes through a sort of a virtuous circle of growth and attracting passengers to that airport. And to some extent what we've seen is the opposite occur. As Bristol has grown, Cardiff has not particularly grown in recent years. And it comes back to the levelling up agenda. If there was a constrained situation at Bristol, that demand starts shifting to Cardiff. Airlines come in and provide additional services to meet those additional demands, and they start building up an additional route network, and you get this sort of it's not a sort of agglomeration effect, but you know the thing builds up and develops. So the argument is that with the levelling up agenda, a constrained Bristol airport can support a continually improved and a more competitive Cardiff airport, and you get greater competition between the two airports. And I think if you, again, maybe at the risk of sort of confusing people, if you carry on down that document to table 2.2, it gives, I'm not too sure whether this is a purely hypothetical example or whether this was actually what was being considered, but it gives the examples of potential long-haul routes serving New York and the Middle East. And it shows, you know, what happens if one airport provides a service. In this case, you know, if Bristol was to provide a service to New York, that base in 2017, with different competition positions, which meant that actually activity would be attracted to Cardiff, then that makes it more difficult for Bristol to provide that service to New York. And the same with the Middle East example. So it shows you how that a situation can arise. There's not enough demand to supply services from both airports, that you know the first mover effectively has the advantage of developing those sort of more longer haul routes. And presumably, you know, one of the reasons why the Welsh Government has supported the route to Doha is to get that first mover advantage over Bristol. But it shows you this cumulative impact that you could have as passengers transfer from one airport to another.
Thank you. So I'm just looking at the time. We've not got a huge amount more to do. It's probably about 10 or 15 minutes, but you might want to break. Keep going. Keep going. Okay. Thank you. So Now, in the context of this displacement issue, if we go back to the way in which it was treated in the economic impact assessment addendum, which we've got at CD 222, we obviously we know the position has changed in terms of the displacement no longer being a sensitivity, but let's just have a look at what was said about its implications in the addendum from back in, I think, the end of November of last year, 326 on page 13 of the document, 16 of the PDF. Potential impact of product displacement is the heading. It's always weird to think of people being described as products, but there we are. Page 13 internally, 16 of the MPPF, 326, CD 222. Here we see the explanation that the original assessment didn't seek to quantify potential offsetting. It says, given the market share of the main London airports and the position of Birmingham Airport compared to the much smaller airports in the South West and South Wales, it was assessed that this effect, that's the displacement effect, would likely to be limited. You see that?
I do, yes.
We know, and you've already explained, in reality the effect is what, 28%? What's your view as to that assessment, whether a 28% displacement is limited?
I think if you were told your salary was to be reduced by 28%, you wouldn't say it was limited. You would say it was actually a significant amount and a significant reduction.
All right, thank you. Right, let's move on then. I think we've got 4 more broad topics. Move away from displacement and the consideration of outbound tourism. Now, just summarise, please, the position for the inspectors. What you're saying about outbound tourism and why it's a relevant matter.
So outbound tourism is, the appellant fairly states that outbound tourism exists. They conclude that it's unlikely to be significant. And the view has often been that it shouldn't be considered for various reasons, and the DFT document refers to the situation with outbound tourism, and it's difficult to quantify and all these other things. I think our view is that, as stated in the Treasury's Green Book, we should be quantifying all benefits and disbenefits. It's up to the decision maker what weight they want to put on that disbenefit. That's entirely up to them. But I think, it is difficult to see why you can set out very clearly what you think the inbound tourism benefits are, but gloss over the fact there are outbound tourism disbenefits. And I think we heard in the first week of the inquiry that the reference was made to the level of tourism deficit in the trade terms, that the number has almost doubled since 2013 in that deficit when that comment was made by the DFT. So again, what we're suggesting is that it's a number that should be drawn to the attention of a decision maker, and as I say, what weight they wish to put onto it is obviously down to them.
Okay, thank you. Next, I want to take us to page 43 of your proof, and this is in your section 7, context for assessment. I just want you to explain some of the points that you've got in this section. So, page 43, paragraph 722, you refer to the structure. This is looking at the nature of of positions that may be generated by expansion, which you say are likely to be low valued or low skilled posts, which are generally at high risk of being automated. And you go on to say that the airport is a large employer, and the expansion, if it does require additional employment in 2013, will reduce the labour supply pool for other firms in the area. Can you just explain that point, please, in a bit more detail and why it matters?
So, in 7.2.1, we quote the appellant's document to explain the nature of jobs that are envisaged to be provided at the airport. As it says, they are NVQ level 1 and level 2, the majority of those jobs. What North Somerset Council's aspirations are is to upskill its labour force. They are promoting the whole of the Junction 21 enterprise area to attract local jobs and to support businesses in that area. They have an interesting planning regime where the site has both homes and jobs, and there is a link between development in homes and jobs. The housing developer cannot build the homes unless there's a link between the ratio maintained between jobs and housing. So it incentivizes a developer to bring in jobs into the area. And the scale of jobs that are being proposed at Junction 21 Enterprise are far higher than those at the airport. The development at Junction 21 is taking place on a brownfield site, unlike what's being proposed at Bristol, which requires a green belt there as well. So they're the sort of the differences between the two. Now, Mr. Brass, in his rebuttal, draws attention to the sort of salary levels at the airport. And that rebuttal, it effectively takes some information which is provided in CD 2.22. So if you take CD 2.22 and go to figure 3.8 on page 26. And this same chart appears in Mr. Brass's rebuttal.
So it was figure
3.8
3.8
on page 26.
page 29 of the PDF. Yeah.
Do you have that, sir?
I do.
So here you see, as I say, it's presented in the rebuttal as well. So the figure shows average salaries at Bristol Airport in the west of England and in the southwest. Now the paragraph above that, in 3.77, says that the final sentence, it said it should be recognised that the data on which this is based is limited and at a company rather than individual employee level, but it still provides an order of magnitude of view. Now, the issue with this table is we don't know what it's comparing what with what, in the sense that the numbers provided for the southwest and west of England are all employees, both full and part-time employees, which is the reason why those numbers get down to below the minimum wage in the 10% percentile. And we don't know what the distribution of full and part-time workers at Bristol Airport, which is being compared against. So it's very difficult to draw any conclusions from that table as to the comparative salaries at the airport for equivalent full-time jobs or part-time jobs to the west of England and in the southwest. And then if you turn to figure 3.9 in the same document on page 29, you will see an income distribution of passengers at Bristol Airport, and you will see a slightly different shade of, I always get colours wrong, so I would say it's purple, but some people probably tell me it's not. So you see a southwest average salary band, which falls between 34,500 and 40,249. If you go back to figure 3.8, you will see the median salary there for the southwest of England is, at a guess, somewhere around 22,000. So either the average salary in the southwest is a lot higher than the salaries at the airport, or and those salaries are right, they are correct against the ONS data, or the salary figure on figure 3.9 is not correct, or is showing something different and not showing an average salary. So I just wanted to draw your attention to, it is difficult to draw any conclusions from those figures.
All right, thank you. Now, last two points to make. The first of them is Brexit and the relevance of that to our considerations in the socio-economic topic. What do you want to draw the inquiry's attention on that?
So any mention of Brexit raises the temperature. So I think that there are a number of issues to do with Brexit, but perhaps the one which is probably of relevance here most of all is to do with business travel. So Mr. Brass rightly says in the econometric forecasting that if Brexit has a positive or negative impact on the economy, then that will translate through into passenger demand, and that's quite straightforward. But what we're also seeing is a slightly, and we talked quite a bit about global Britain and the opening up of Asia, etc. What we've also seen a lot in the press is the fact we've got a free trade agreement with the European Union, but there are a lot of non-tariff barriers to trade, and the press has been full of businesses struggling to import and export and giving up on the EU. And the UK hasn't yet introduced its full customs controls, which come in place on the 1st of January. Now, all those issues may be perfectly resolved and everything goes back to fine and dandy, or the situation could deteriorate and it has an impact on business. And sorry, one thing I wanted to draw your attention to. I'm not sure if I can find a reference. I can't find the reference, apologies, but you may recall, and if somebody knows the reference, they can maybe point us to it. You may recall that COF globalization index that was presented, Mr. Brass was talking about. And it may be purely coincidence or it may be a correlation, but if you look at that graph, you will see that the steepest parts of the curve are in the early 1970s when the UK joined the EEC, as it then was, and about early 1992 when the single European market commenced. And you saw increases in trade, and those increases in trade obviously drives increased demand. What we're seeing is, those, as I said, those non-tariff barriers increasing with the EU, and we're seeing a globalization. And I think the important point to bear in mind here is that the vast majority of businesses in the region, as they are everywhere in the country, are relatively small businesses. If you want to import or export from the European Union in the past, you would have jumped on a plane and you would have gone to France to sell your cheese or whatever it might have been. If you want to import or export from Japan, the likelihood is you're going to use an agent based in that country. As a small business, you can't afford the time, the fare, the understanding of a completely new market. So although economic growth may continue and may increase due to globalization, the travel patterns of businesses may change depending on the areas of the world that you are increasingly trading with. So, that is an issue to sort of think about. It may all disappear, but it comes back to this point about uncertainty and how uncertainty is treated throughout the economic impact assessment.
Thank you. I think that curve is in Mr. Brass's forecasting proof, figure 15, page 53. I think we looked at it the other day. I don't think we need to look at it again now. Right, last point, everybody will be relieved to hear. Carbon costs. Mr. Ciro, you've got that on page 53 of your proof, where you look at analysis not undertaken by the appellant. What do you want the inspectors to note in relation to carbon costs, please?
So one of the issues that I highlighted at the beginning was the difference in the economic benefits being reported in CD 208 and in CD 222. And one of those differences was due to the increase, the costing of carbon being put in that later version. And that's obviously to be welcome, and the appellant has done the right thing, but for putting in carbon in there. What we're not clear is the value of carbon that's been used. The DFT is saying we should be using the high value of carbon. It's not clear whether the high value of carbon was used or whether the average value of carbon was used in the assessment. There's then the question of noise and air quality. So we would expect the noise and air quality issues to also be costed. You could argue, and the appellant argues, that they are relatively small and therefore it's not proportional to do so. But until we actually see that the numbers, it's difficult to come to a view on that. So we would put forward the view that without the full picture of all the costs and benefits of the scheme, it's difficult to come to a judgment as to what the overarching economic benefits of the scheme may be.
Mr. Ciro, thank you very much. Unless, have you got anything else you wanted to raise at this stage?
No.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. That's the examination in chief, and we're almost 10 minutes under our time estimate too.
Well, that being the case, can I just take the chance just to ask a quick question of the witness before and then we'll have a quick break. Just take you to paragraph 7.2.2. What caught my eye was you say that Bristol Airport, a large employer, if it does require additional employment in 2030, it will reduce the labour supply pool for other firms in the area. That reads a little bit like an argument not to grow any large business at all anywhere, but that's surely not what you mean, is it?
Sorry, so which paragraph are you referring to?
7.2.2, second sentence, page 43.
I think that the point being made here is that North Somerset Council want to encourage local businesses, local entrepreneurs. Economic growth comes through that local business, local entrepreneur approach. It wants to develop a higher skilled economy. At the moment, North Somerset Council is an out-commuting borough. A lot of those people with high skills are going into Bristol. It wants to bring back those sorts of jobs into the local economy and support the development of that local economy. If you go round Junction 21 Enterprise area, you'll see Food Works, which is their sort of flagship type project. It's encouraging new business startups, innovative businesses, and that's the way they want to drive their economy. So it's not saying we don't want jobs. It's coming back to, without putting words in North Somerset Council's mouth, they want higher quality jobs. They don't just want any jobs. They want good jobs, sustainable jobs, and green jobs. And I think the question with the airport is that, as we've heard, it's a low-cost operators. We know low-cost operators want to drive down costs. They want to increase efficiency. We don't know what the impacts of the Carbon 6 budget are going to be, where that's going to increase costs and reduce demand at the airport. These are all unknowns. The question in the council's mind is, are the jobs at the airport going to be long-term sustainable jobs compared to other opportunities and supporting entrepreneurs in the local area?
Thank you. All right. 15 minutes, 20. Okay, should we come back at 4:15 then? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Inquiry is now resumed. Mr. Humphreys, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Would you be able to find, you think, a suitable time to break in about an hour? Give or take. I mean, we're not precious about 5–10 minutes either way.
Yes, I'll.
But we didn't want to go beyond 5:30 tonight.
I know, and to be honest, I don't either. You know, as I was saying just now, Mr. Taylor's cross-examined one witness. I think I've done about 10 now over the course of this week and last week. So I'd prefer not to go too late. Mr. Ciro, good afternoon.
So forgive me. Good afternoon, sir.
Mr. Ciro, just before we go too much further, I just want to understand, to make sure I've fully got right, the implication of one thing that you said fairly early on, actually, in your evidence in chief. You produce in your evidence figures where you challenged the airport's assessment of direct employment impacts. And in Mr. Brass's rebuttal, he said that you had miscalculated that. You'd used employment from 1 year and passenger numbers from a different year. And he actually set out in that paragraph the correct figures. And then you produced more recently, I think it's INQ 11, 26th of July, an errata to the economic impact assessment proof that then carried out a recalculation using an earlier year's passenger numbers, and Mr. Brass then produced a very short sort of, I think it was a side and a bit note. In fact, I think the relevant bit was less than side, saying, no, you still got the wrong year's passenger numbers. And in your evidence in chief, you said, we are content to take the appellant's views on direct employment impacts. So that I have not misunderstood this and sort of don't ask you lots of questions about something under a misapprehension. My understanding is that you now accept that the correct passenger number should be the year to the end of 2017, because that was the year that the employment data was collected, and that for that year the passengers were 8.2 million, and therefore you are accepting Mr. Brass's direct employment figures.
Yes, so for the avoidance of doubt, we are accepting the appellant's numbers on direct employment.
Right. Now, in INQ 11, we look at that just for a moment. There's a table 2-2. Do you have that?
I do not. Sorry, where do I find it on the system?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know about your system, but INQ 11 is it's your document. It's the one you put in a couple of days ago.
So it's the errata on the...
Correct.
Yeah.
Do you have it?
I do, if you bear with me for a moment.
The first table.
I think In fact, sir, I think it's not the first table. 2-2, I think, is probably, well, actually, you could use, sorry, yes, I think you could probably use 2- or 1-1. It has the same figures. I was just looking at a different table. But whether we look at 2-2 or 1-1, the appellant's figures are in the top line there. Do you see?
I do, yes.
And I think what you're now telling us is that you agree those figures.
Yes, we do.
Okay, that's thank you for confirming that. Just to sort of understand the implications of this, if we turn on section 3 in that document, INQ11, the errata, then amended a whole series of other tables in your proof of evidence, 5 of them,
Yes.
with what we've now agreed are not the right figures. But I imagine it's a simple
It's a simple matter of correcting them.
mathematical exercise that maybe would assist the inspectors to have your corrected figures. By inviting you to do that, I'm not asking for further commentary, input, justification, anything, but insofar as adjusting that one table means that you need to adjust 5 other tables, perhaps that could be done.
Certainly, yes.
So I wonder if I might just indicate here that the reason we haven't spent time on it is because the difference between us actually was so small. The tables show that we were arguing about £1 million. So it really wasn't worth spending inquiry time over. That's why Mr. Ciro said it wasn't proportionate to spend time on it at the inquiry. So that's why it's been done.
Yes, I think also in fairness to Mr. Ciro, he's accepted you need to compare the right job data with the right passenger data. It might make a small difference, but that would be appropriate, wouldn't it?
It would, but again, the reason why the number that we used was not the number that Mr. Brass put in his rebuttal was because I think it was CD 208 or 220 used a different number, and that was a number, so there was an inconsistency in the appellant's data. So there was, that was the reason we weren't being awkward in putting forward a revised numbers, which were not the same as Mr. Brass's rebuttal numbers. So,
but I think we've landed in the same place, haven't we?
Yes.
That our figures are correct, so that there will be these minor amendments, fine, which means I don't need to ask you about that. You did say, but it may be a slight legacy from earlier versions of your proof at 1 or 2 points, automation over time and everything else, but we have now agreed the employment figures, haven't we?
we have, yes.
Okay. Jacobs were, of course, the consultants who advised the council during the pre-application period. Were you personally part of that team?
I was not.
No. So, as with Mr. Foley, who was also not, we have no witnesses at all from the council who were actually advised in the lead up to the determination of the application.
That is correct.
You, as a firm, obviously advise a number of airports in the UK and internationally, and you mentioned a number of them, Heathrow and Brisbane on your website, Columbus, Ohio, Mumbai, Dallas, Fort Worth, lots and lots of them. And your work for those clients fully acknowledges, doesn't it, the economic benefits of airport expansion?
I haven't worked on any of those particular projects, so I can't say what we've said about those individual projects.
Okay, but as a generality, you acknowledge, don't you? I mean, we can see it in the evidence in the tables we've just been talking about. You acknowledge the economic benefits of airport expansion.
That's correct. I just didn't want to mislead people to say that I'd worked on any of those projects you
No,
mentioned.
sorry, I chose those ones at random. And obviously the views of Jacobs as consultants are recorded in the officer's report, and indeed in Mr. Brass's report he draws attention to some of them. But Jacobs had some differences with York Aviation on the calculation of figures, but generally then, as indeed I think in fairness now, you identified substantial economic benefits from the expansion of Bristol Airport.
We recognise there are economic benefits of the expansion of Bristol Airport. That is correct, yes.
And the difference between us, therefore, is not about the principle, it's about the precise numbers.
Yes, I think, we set out, I think it was in the Statement of Common Ground, that the methodologies were used. I think we had issues with those. It was some of the underlying assumptions. And as you raised, some of those were raised previously in advice to the council previously, and are referred to in some of the council advice as well. Or not advice, but, the paper the council put forward.
Without hopefully spending too long on it, I just want to touch on some of the national and local economic policy relating to economic impacts, because that's an important context for us, isn't it?
Yes.
Can we look first then at CD 6.1? That's the aviation policy framework, and we're going to look at page 9. And paragraph 5, page 9 in the PDF. Maybe, yes, it is also actual page 9. So CD 6.1. That, you can read paragraph 5. I've read it before, I'm not going to read it out. But that, what is described as primary objective of policy, remains, doesn't it, an important framework to our discussion about the importance of expanding airports.
So the government's primary objective is to achieve long-term economic growth. There are lots of ways that it can achieve long-term economic growth.
Of course.
And obviously the aviation sector, as it says, is a major contributor. So that's
yes.
a matter of fact, yes.
And you wouldn't disagree with that?
No.
And more recently, we just touch on another theme. And as I say, I'm trying not to, we could go into lots and lots of paragraphs. I'm trying not to do that, but just sort of understand the basic planks, the broad framework within which this exercise is going out. So CD 6.5 is Aviation 2050, and in there perhaps look at page 18. And I think here it's real page 18, PDF page 20, sorry. Sometimes I've written the PDF page and sometimes not. And again, you can see the
in the bold text at the top, government's view on the role that aviation has to play in the future of the country. Sorry, we're PDF page 20. Just say it any time. I know how, you know, you're sort of writing and... No, I have the same problem. PDF page 20, again, I'm not going to read it all out. You can see there, see paragraph 1.2, clear about the importance of aviation to the whole of the UK, creates jobs. Again, that's an important and frankly enduring plank of government policy, isn't it? The importance of international aviation, connectivity, these things for our economy. And again, that's something that you, my understanding, entirely endorse.
Yes.
If we go on slightly, paragraph 1.8, and again, I'll try not to be tiresome about it, but you see there the document sets out the various reasons why, bottom of page 20, actual page 20 over to 21, and through to page 21, the reasons why aviation is so important: connectivity, productivity, jobs, and tourism.
Yes.
And obviously, the government realizes, but perfectly aware, that as a generality, we have more outgoing tourism than incoming tourism. But government still recognizes tourism as being something that's important, isn't it? People having the right to go abroad, spend their money in other parts of the world if they want to on holidays. We know, don't we, that these themes of the importance of aviation to our economy haven't just been made in a sort of pre-net zero world, they've continued. So let's look at CD 6.8. This is the Grant Shapps statement to Parliament on, I think it was either the day I'd lost in the Court of Appeal or the day after I'd lost in the Court of Appeal on the airport national policy statement. Got there in the end though. And what the Minister said in the statement, obviously fully in the knowledge of net zero, which had been in place for some time then, fully in the knowledge of what the Court of Appeal, of a decision not overturned, but what the Court of Appeal said about that, he maintained the position our airports are national assets and their expansion is a core part of boosting our global connectivity. This in turn will drive economic growth for all parts of the country, connecting our nations and regions to international markets, levelling up our economy and supporting a truly global Britain. And towards the bottom of that page, again, I won't read it all out, but he says he fully recognises the importance of the aviation sector to the whole of the economy, and then later in that paragraph talks about making best use. Making best use, therefore, even in a post net zero world, remains an important plank of government policy, and the Minister actually went to Parliament to make that clear in the context of the Court of Appeal decision. Yeah?
Sorry, was there a question? Sorry.
Yeah. It remains an important part of policy, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
And net zero hasn't detracted from that, has it?
No.
Then you've mentioned Build Back Better. Maybe we don't need to look at that one as you drew attention to it. For the record, it's CD 1110. But your point that you made, or one of your points that you made about Build Back Better is, of course, there can be disparities even within prosperous regions. And you pointed to Newham, London Borough of Newham, where London City Airport is located. And of course, it's important, isn't it, to bear that in mind, although you've talked about the relative prosperity of the southwest and indeed Bristol. Your point is absolutely right, isn't it, though? It's important, you use the word nuance. It's important, isn't it, to look beyond the headline and be a little bit more nuanced, and what your own evidence tells us on that is that close to the airport there are, it's your figure 3.3, so your evidence page 12, see the different colours for the particular quintiles for deprivation, and you can see in South Bristol and indeed near the N of North Somerset, Weston-super-Mare, there are areas of real deprivation, aren't there?
There are areas of deprivation in South Bristol as well as in parts of Weston-super-Mare, yes.
And indeed, you know, without putting too fine a point on it, one only has to, I'm afraid, sadly walk around parts of Weston-super-Mare to see that.
Yes.
And actually, it's a really important part of policy, sub-regionally and indeed locally, perhaps we'll look at this, to do something about that.
That's correct, yes.
There are policies, again, maybe I don't need to laboriously take you through them, but policies in the west of England, local industrial strategy, the North Somerset economic plan, the North Somerset core strategy. All of those seek to encourage investment into this area, don't they?
They do, yes.
And many of them point to both the port, Avonmouth, and Bristol Airport as being important.
They are.
To economic performance.
They are.
I think, in fact, the West of England local industrial strategy, in effect, illustrates in one of its figures, again, we can look at it, how the port and the airport are at the centre of a cluster of enterprise zones.
They are, yes.
You know, there are projects like the Gravity project site not far from the airport, which is an enterprise zone which you know, is welcoming, shall we say, of foreign direct investment, inward investment to the country.
Yes.
Junction 21, exactly the same. I think Mr. Brass pointed out, actually, that on the Junction 21 website, it actually advertises the fact that it's close to Bristol Airport.
Yes, you would expect, all the local agencies, the Bristol Airport exists, nobody's proposing to close it, it's going to provide a wide range of services. Obviously, you make the best use of an asset that you've got in your area in promoting your region to investors within that to come into that region.
But they don't advertise it by saying, look, we've got this airport, post-pandemic, it'll be close to capacity, so, don't bother to come here if international connectivity is what you're interested in. It doesn't say that, does it?
No, just like any West of London promotion activities doesn't say Heathrow it is constrained in capacity. It promotes the range of flights that exist from that airport. It promotes the fact, as we've seen, the number of major international centres which are accessible from the airport, and it is right to do that. And we're not saying
why is that important?
Because, as we've seen, international connectivity is important. As I've said, people want to see people from business travel. That business travel, we would suggest, is not as great as it was before. But as I said, that airport exists. You want to make the best use of that asset as it exists at the moment. It has a range of destinations. Whether it's capacity constrained or not, you're still going to use that as an asset to promote your area.
And as Mr. Brass pointed out in his evidence, I think we looked at it yesterday is one of the figures in his, I think, forecasting evidence. The West of England, Southwest also has high population growth, doesn't it? Way above the UK average. Do you want me to take you to that?
You can take me to that. I was just...
I mean, you can either agree it, because I imagine you've read it, or we can go to it. I don't mind. I think, from recollection, it was figure 11, but don't trust me on that. Mr. Surratt, it's figure 11. It's on page 25 of Mr. Brass's forecasting proof. And what it shows is the southwest and the west of England by 2030 would have 10% more population. West of England would have 10% greater population than it did in 2018, and the trend is much higher.
Yes, and I'd like to refer maybe the inspectors to figure 8.2 in my proof of evidence. And it comes back to this whole issue of uncertainty, where we see estimates of changes in UK and foreign-born population, which shows a decline in population over the last year. So it comes back to this issue of huge levels of uncertainty and how things will develop post-Brexit, post-pandemic. I accept entirely that those are ONS forecasts, but, as I said in my proof of evidence, figure 8.2, it shows a different set of numbers. It shows ONS numbers for a decline in UK-born population. And we're back to this problem of forecasting the future in a time of considerable uncertainty.
Yes, but you're not suggesting, are you, that we should be planning on the basis that the UK population, particularly in this part of the UK, will decline, are you?
I think I would be suggesting we should be planning on the basis of caution as to what the future might hold.
Yes.
And, there's a question about what that future population might look like.
But as I think has been made clear before, one of the characteristics of airport planning is that there are relatively long lead times. It's not something where you can just extend an airport and add capacity instantly. In this case, the
process from the original application to now, let alone a decision, has taken a considerable length of time. And even then, construction won't have started. It's important, isn't it, that we take authoritative forecasts like the ONS, and we rely on those. You're not suggesting otherwise. Are you suggesting otherwise?
So, as I say, my proof is, again, ONS figures, which show a different picture. So, again, there is an uncertainty, and I entirely agree, and having been involved, like many others, in major infrastructure projects, we are incredibly slow at developing them. So, it's incredibly difficult. You know, in some ways I agree that, you know, we need certainty and we need to plan, etc. But then again, are we making decisions which have a long-term impact, which may or may not be necessary?
Yes.
And, you know, those are obviously decision makers need to weigh up those pros and cons.
You made a point then in your evidence in chief about the types of jobs and the quality of jobs at the airport, and we've agreed now that we agree on the number of jobs, and those jobs will exist, and we can probably agree, can't we, that the people that take those jobs will take those jobs because, for whatever personal reason, they prefer those jobs to not doing anything or what they were doing before.
Yes, you want to assume that people will make a rational decision and take
Yes.
the job that's best suited.
And therefore, for those people, the fact that these jobs are available is a benefit to them.
It certainly is, yes.
I don't know whether you were listening in the first week, but one of the virtual witnesses we had was the Unite Union leader at the airport who put it very simply but eloquently, I thought. He said, look, this is about getting a wage and putting food on the table.
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with that.
And for people in South Bristol or Weston-super-Mare, that's pretty important, isn't it?
So I think this is, you know, probably a
Is it
topic.
pretty important?
It's pretty important if they can access those jobs. So
Right.
Bristol and Weston are
that they
within
will take
15
those
minutes
jobs.
of... Do you mind if I finish my point?
Well, we have agreed, haven't we, that those jobs will appear.
We've said those jobs will appear. The question is, can residents in South Bristol and Weston actually access those jobs physically? And as I said, it's principally a question for the transport side. You know, those locations are within 15-minute drive of the airport. If you've got a car, it's fantastic. If you come off, you know, a flight crew at 2 o'clock in the morning and you've got to get back home, then, and you don't have a car, then it's a different situation completely. You know, the airport provides, you know, staff discounts, fantastic, but they don't necessarily go to those deprived areas where potential staff could live. So it's a question about ensuring that, you know, if approval is given for the expansion, that the policies are in place to ensure those residents, as you rightly say, in Weston, in the deprived parts of Weston and South Bristol, actually can access physically and have, you know, the skilled and training programs are being proposed, and that's fantastic. But, you know, that accessibility is a key issue which I don't think has been resolved, and obviously it's for other witnesses to talk about more.
That point is one, as indeed I touched on in opening, where together with the council, and of course, you know, originally indeed with officers, those things were very closely considered, and there are packages of measures that are being offered, aren't there? And I think continued to be discussed, so far as I'm aware, with the council to offer various different forms of support, including sort of educational training, skills type support, and those are things you would want to see.
Yeah, and you know, obviously that is important. That skills and training element is important, and it's welcome. And the accessibility, as I said, it's can you actually physically access those jobs if you don't have your own transport? But that is probably for other witnesses to talk about the transport side.
And then you made points about airport jobs and salaries, and you looked at the table earlier in the economic impact assessment addendum, and you made various comments about, well, you didn't accept the comparators. What we see, though, from that table is that at a range of different income and therefore, I suspect, correlated with skill levels, the airport is offering actually very good wages for people.
Well, as I say, I don't. The caveats on that data, which I drew attention to, I think it's difficult to draw any conclusions. There obviously are jobs which pay reasonable wages. We don't know what the distribution of those jobs is because of the samples. And I say we're not clear, whether we're comparing apples and pears. But I accept there will be jobs with
but as,
reasonable levels of
as
pay.
we agreed, the people that will take those jobs, for them, it will be better than whatever the next best alternative was.
I agree.
So for them, it's an improvement.
It is.
Those real people. So we then come to section 4 of your proof, where you deal with business passengers. And here, there seems to be a fair degree of overlap, if I may say so, between your evidence and Mr. Foley's evidence, and I've actually cross-examined him on a whole lot of these things, and I don't suppose he's the forecaster after all on numbers of business passengers. I don't suppose you disagree with him, do you?
Sorry, I'm trying to recall on the forecast what we were.
Well, you have a whole series of sections here where in one way or another you talk about growth of business passengers or propensity to fly. Do you remember? And I've asked Mr. Foley a whole series of questions about those things. And I'm basically saying I assume your case is consistent. I don't need to ask all the same questions, do I? Or perhaps I do.
Sorry, I'm trying to think of the sort of questions you're asking and the points that were being made. I think we come at this from a slightly different perspective in terms of what the future. I think we're consistent in putting the point across that we expect business passenger growth to grow less than leisure passenger growth. So I think we are consistent in that, and I think we are consistent in those approaches going forward.
Yes. As you know, well, I'll sort of touch on it a little bit, but I genuinely am keen not to get back into the forecasting stuff. As you acknowledged in your evidence in chief, we've forecast the growth in passengers from the econometric modelling. And it's an output of the modelling.
It is, yes.
You haven't run, not suggesting you should have, an alternative econometric model.
Certainly not.
What you've done, what Mr. Foley did, was look at historic trends at Bristol. Do you remember? And we looked at INQ 13. And I asked lots of questions about that. And your own evidence, we can see it at paragraph 4.3.4, turn to that. Looks at exactly that same data. You just repeat Mr. Foley's point.
Yes.
But what that shows is, over that period, which you have chosen, we did not choose, in fact, business passenger numbers growing at 4.2% per annum.
It does, yes.
But you don't then adopt that, do you, having pointed to it?
No, because we've said there's this fundamental break, which, as we can see from the DFT also recognise, has been this fundamental break in the linkages, which has resulted in, because of the changes in people's behaviour,
Yes.
so that econometric model, I would suggest, is no longer, has the same level of forecasting ability that it might have done in the past.
Yes, but those percentages, 4.2, aren't based on an econometric model. They're based on what actually happened. You draw attention to it, but you then ignore it.
What we've set out in the proof, sorry, what I've set out in the proof, is that this fact that leisure traffic has grown faster than business traffic. And we have assumed that will continue going forward based on the long-term trends, based on the graph that Mr. Brass had about Heathrow Airport, if you will recall. That we've seen this steady decline as a proportion of total passengers of business passengers. And that is what we have taken forward. So in trying to come up with alternatives in terms of the impacts on business productivity, I've taken that 4.1% and actually halved it to 2%, so it's actually broadly in line with the sort of the recent trends with the adjustments that we all went through the other day. But the key point is that differential between the growth in leisure passengers and the growth in business passengers going forward, and therefore the impacts on business productivity.
Okay, let's just look at how you've actually used the data. So you have your two scenarios, paragraph 4311 and 4312, balanced view and optimistic approach. Optimistic approach uses the 4.2 versus the 8.1. In essence, what you say is leisure would grow at twice the rate of business based on that data from 2000 to 2019.
It grows at 4 times.
Sorry?
It grows at 4 times.
Well, all right, the two percentages, the 4.2 is approximately half the 8.1, as I understand it.
Sorry, I switched off for a millisecond there. Could you say that again? Sorry.
What you say is an optimistic approach might be to assume that the differential growth rates between business and leisure passengers, 4.2, 8.1, would grow to the extent that it doubles. That is, leisure would grow 4 times faster than business.
Yes.
So it doubles.
Yeah.
So what you then do, if we look at the table, you look at table 4.3, for each of the appellant's figures, you simply halve your optimistic figure.
That's correct.
That's correct. So you've assumed half the amount of growth in the number of business passengers and therefore half the amount of benefit that we calculated.
That's correct, yes.
Yes. We'll come back to that. But then your balanced estimate, you get 0 for everything.
That's correct.
In other words, what you've assumed on what you call a balanced approach is that there is absolutely no growth in business passengers at all.
That is correct.
And even Mr. Foley doesn't believe that.
So it comes back to this point I was
Mr. Foley doesn't believe that, does he?
So
Does Mr. Foley believe that? Does Mr. Foley believe that business at Bristol Airport will not grow at all, i.e. absolute numbers not grow at all?
We're not comparing like with like, because the point that I was making before is looking at the marginal impacts of changes. And you can, the question becomes, if you've got an airport, as I sort of gave that example before, you've got an airport of 10 million passengers, 10% are business, 90% are leisure. They're not the appellant's numbers, it just makes the maths easier. We know that business passengers are less price sensitive to leisure passengers. We know we have a range of destinations which business passengers wish to travel to. If the airport is constrained, there is an argument for saying those business travelers, if they wish to travel, could still travel. And you end up with a situation potentially of 1.2 million business passengers and 8.8 million leisure passengers. So we're not saying that there is no growth at all in business passengers, but it's the marginal impact of the capacity increase in Bristol, how that is used for leisure and business passengers, and what happens when the airport is constrained, and what happens to those business passengers. So it comes back to this whole issue of uncertainty and what would be a conservative approach to take. Yes. Now, again, we've made this point that the future is hugely uncertain, hence this range of numbers that we are giving. And I know it's not helpful potentially in your views in assessing these things, but there is not a single answer because we don't know what the future is, but it is so uncertain.
Mr. Ciro, the problem with that very long answer is you've completely missed the point of your own table. Table 4.3 isn't a constrained airport, it's the airport growing. This is the airport at 12 million. And what you say in the airport at 12 million is that there would be, on your balanced approach, no additional impact. There would be no benefit whatsoever. And you can only come to that conclusion on the basis that business passengers haven't grown. Not grown as a percentage, but they haven't grown in absolute numbers. So let's not go back to constraint and whether it's you stay at 10 million but a greater proportion of business passengers. Let's assume we're getting to 12 million. Where is the evidence, because it's not from Mr. Foley, that business passengers would not grow at all?
So it comes back to this point, which I'm obviously explaining very badly. Because if you take the situation where if the airport was constrained, you could still get to this 1.2 million passengers, business passengers, in my example. So the airport expands to 12 million passengers. What is the marginal benefit of that expansion if you could still accommodate that potential, if there's a growth in business passengers, you could still accommodate those business passengers under the old constrained 10 million. It doesn't matter that the airport now handles 12 million. The question is what would have happened in that expansion from 10 to 12 million.
Yeah, but Mr. Ciro, the problem with that analysis is if you are saying with a constrained airport where prices would have been higher, business passengers will still, in effect, buy their way through, they'll still get there, then in an unconstrained airport, the demand from business passengers would be even higher, because then the price per ticket is lower. They've only forced their way through in the constrained airport because they have a higher propensity to pay a higher price. But even more of them would pay a lower price, wouldn't they?
But again, it comes back to this issue.
Even more of them would pay a lower price, wouldn't they?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes. The explanation that you have given us for why there is no benefit, you said it's not because there are not more passengers, business passengers in the 12 million case, it's because in a 10 million case, those passengers would be willing to pay a higher price to get there. In other words, there is a pent-up demand, they pay a higher price in a constrained airport. But in an unconstrained airport, that pent-up demand would mean there would be even more of them. That's basic economics.
Potentially, if the demand to fly is there.
Exactly.
And it comes back to this point about the changing behaviours and whether people are going to fly in the future for business purposes.
So your so-called balanced approach assumes, doesn't it, either a counterfactual in which business passengers would still fly despite all of the stuff you told us about video conferencing and all the rest of it, extra ones would fly in a constrained airport case, or it implies that in a larger airport, a 12 MPP airport, there are no additional business flights at all, despite Mr. Foley's evidence. Now, which is it?
Sorry, it's getting late in the day.
It's all right.
Struggling to keep up with the question. Sorry, can you repeat the question again? Sorry, I apologise.
Yes, you've created, with this no economic benefit from expanding an airport at all, you seem to have two explanations of this. One is there's no growth in business passengers. You postulate that on the basis that, oh, well, there's video conferencing and COVID and Brexit and everything else. Your other sort of 180-degree opposite one is that, well, actually, no, none of that applies, and in a constrained airport, your extra passengers would fly through business passengers would fly through the airport, but they'd also then fly through an expanded airport. There's no evidence for any of this.
It comes back to this question of uncertainty. We don't know what these various outcomes are likely to be.
What we can see, though, if we, instead of going down that particular route, what you call your balanced view, we go down the optimistic view, that entire scenario where you simply halve every benefit we have, that entire scenario is based on Mr. Foley's figures here. They were also set out in his proof. This fact that between 2000 and 2019, the business growth was 4.2% and leisure 8.1%.
That's correct, yes.
And despite the low-cost bubble, all those different things that we've pointed out to you, you just assume that it is somehow appropriate to project that forward from 2019 to 2030.
So there have been lots of one-offs, as it were, that have impacted. And what we're trying to do is take a long-term view. Again, it comes back to this point about we've seen this decline of business passengers as a proportion of leisure passengers. What we're trying to demonstrate by taking these two figures from 2000 to 2019 is that leisure passengers have grown more than business passengers. So there's a trend that has occurred in the past. And in the future, we're seeing changes in business practices, which in our view would extend that difference between the growth in leisure passengers and the growth in business passengers going forward.
What we actually see is not a decline in the business passengers, but a fairly flat level, 14% over 12 years or so in business passengers, with 1 year, 2015, when they were higher because BMI Regional came into the market.
That's correct on the figures that we've got.
Yes. And BMI Regional left the market for quite separate reasons, financial difficulties. But if those routes were taken back up again, there's no reason to suppose, is there, that we wouldn't be achieving 17%? Not what we have assumed, but that would be perfectly plausible on the historic data, wouldn't it?
Well, we don't know whether those routes were profitable. Obviously, BMI went out of business, and their load factors, as we heard, were very low. We don't know what they were at Bristol. There's a question about the viability of those routes.
Well, the numbers of seats grew, didn't they, from 2012, 2015 and 2019.
And it went bankrupt.
Now, you then make points about, well, there won't be this growth in business travel because of business destinations from Bristol. And here I'm not quite sure what the case was. On the one hand, my understanding was Mr. Foley seemed to be saying that there are lots of business destinations from Bristol, and because there were lots of business destinations, there's no reason why business traffic would increase. There weren't any more destinations. You seem to be taking rather the opposite point, that there aren't many business destinations. So again, from North Somerset Council Jacob's point of view, what is the case we are facing?
So there are obviously, the airport serves a large number of destinations, most of them on a relatively infrequent basis, but it does serve, core cities, but they are not particularly frequent flights. So Amsterdam, 40 flights a week, which is whatever that is, getting on for 6 flights a day. So it's sort of trying to get this balance between saying that it is principally a leisure airport, but of those business destinations it serves, it does provide those services, and going forward we would expect those city destinations to be continued to be served.
Yes, and one might expect frequencies to increase.
Potentially.
Yes, and as Mr. Foley told us, and Mr. Brass also told us, the econometric modelling doesn't model individual routes. That's not what it's intended to do, is it?
No, it's not.
So it's no criticism. I don't think you're making a criticism of the forecasts that it doesn't identify individual routes.
No, we're not.
So that is almost quarter past. I think that probably would be or could be an appropriate time if I put it like that. There are many times I could stop, but I'm happy to stop now.
Okay. Anybody have anything before we?
So just one very quick point. We're intending in relation to Hilary Byrne to circulate a document just suggesting how we propose to call her so that there's no ambiguity amongst parties. Clearly, we're happy to discuss it should anyone wish it to be done differently, but we're proposing to split her evidence into 2 sections. But in fact, her evidence, I think, will cover, for example, spatial access, which may come under transport. But if we circulate that document and then people can consider it.
Yes, so I think on this, I think the general idea, I don't really object to it, but I thought the general idea was that we were going to call the non-technical witnesses generally in the first week, and no objection, but Ms. Byrne was here, she sat through it all, she was sitting over there, so that we were then dealing with the technical witnesses during the individual topics. I don't think Hilary Byrne, in fairness, is a technical witness. She's talking about local experience and various other things. And my assumption, all other things being equal, was that I would just deal with her once, not deal with her multiple times as though she was an expert witness.
Do we want to have a look at what Hilary Byrne said and then come back?
See what the note says.
Yeah.
Get the note in now.
Yeah. Can we have a look at the note?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just a reminder, Mr. Sewer, not to discuss your evidence. Okay. All right. Okay. We'll be back at 9:30 in the morning. Thank you, everybody.